If you would, please take your Bibles with me this morning and turn in them to Exodus chapter 8. Exodus chapter 8, and if you would, please stand with me. As I read, I'll be reading verses 16 through 19 this morning. Verses 16 through 19. Please follow along with me as I read. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Say to Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the earth, so that it may become gnats in all the land of Egypt." And they did so. Aaron stretched out his hand with his staff and struck the dust of the earth. And there were gnats on man and beast. All the dust of the earth became gnats in all the land of Egypt. The magicians tried by their secret arts to produce gnats, but they could not. So there were gnats on man and beast. Then the magician said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. May the Lord add His blessing this morning to the reading of His word. You may be seated. The Bible opens with a very interesting word. The word is actually turned into a phrase, and that phrase looks like this. You can quote it with me if you'd like. In the beginning. Beginning is the word I want to focus on. What's particularly unique about this word beginning is that it carries a nuance of an assumed end. So just catch that for a moment. If I were to say something like, in yesterday's game in the first quarter, you would assume that there was a second, third, and fourth quarter. If I said in yesterday's game, at the opening of the game, you would assume that there is a necessary end of the game. And that's the flavor of this word beginning in the Hebrew. The Hebrew mind would have taken this word to have understood with it a corresponding end, a correlating end to the beginning. So what we need to do when we read this Bible is we need to read in the beginning and understand that the end is already present. And of course that's mind-boggling. Of course that's troubling in some senses, and we're starting to grapple through the sovereignty of God and the responsibility of man. But we need to understand that this is the way the Bible was written. Listen to the words by a commentator named John Sailhammer. He writes this: "The term beginning in biblical Hebrew marks a starting point of a specific duration, as in the beginning of the year. By commencing this history with a beginning, a word often paired with its antonym, end, the author has not only commenced a history of God and His people, but also prepared the way for the consummation of that history at the end of time." So you and I are part of a story that's essentially, according to the Word, completed. It's difficult for us to understand. But we got to understand that when the Bible is introduced that way, it goes on to describe that God is bringing all things into being. So when it says in the beginning, it's a beginning that involves all things, because He brings all things into being in Genesis 1. So this is a history that's all-encompassing, that this Bible tells the story of. And lest you think it's only the beginning of the Bible that's introduced in a way that already has a corresponding end, let's look at just a few passages throughout the Scriptures which demonstrates that this is a continual thought. It's not just an occasional thought. Consider Isaiah 46, 9 and 10. God says, "I am God, there is none like me," declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times, things not yet done. Let's go to the end of the Bible. In Revelation, the Son will declare, I am the Alpha, first letter of the Greek New Testament, or Greek alphabet, and the Omega, last Greek letter of the alphabet, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. The author of Hebrews will describe his time and our time, everything since the ascension of Christ, as being, as he describes, I quote, the last days. Now that's a fascinating statement, isn't it? The last days. That you and I and everything since the time of Christ's ascension are considered the last days. It's like as though you're reading a novel, and that novel has part 1, part 2, part 3, and chapters that go with each part of the novel. When you get into part 3, it's got several chapters left, but you're in the final part of the book. You've passed a threshold, as it were, and that's how the author of Hebrews understands our time. But what's significant is that it is a threshold. There is an ending point. So we are caught up in a story that has a definitive beginning and a definitive end. And I suppose the next question we would ask is, what's this story about? And the author of Genesis is very faithful to give us that answer. It's actually his very next word. In the beginning, God. In other words, this is a story that has a start and an end. And it is about, its middle portion is about God as well as the beginning and the end. And he states this very emphatically by having God's name repeated 35 or 34 times after this throughout the creation narrative, as if to put an exclamation point on it, that this story that you're entering into is about one primary character, and that is the person of God. If that weren't clear, Paul makes it emphatically clear in Romans 11:36 when he writes, "For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen." Now, what does this mean? What should be our first takeaway from this truth from God's Word? That His Word is a story, true story, about Him. What this should tell us as we're sitting here is that we are first and foremost observers versus participants. Now, we are participants. The Bible will make very clear that we are responsible to fulfill the role that God's given us in creation. And it matters. You know, we're dealing with the sovereignty of God and the responsibility of man here at the beginning of this sermon. And it's important to quote from one of my favorite authors, C.S. Lewis, who says this: "You will certainly carry out God's purpose, however you act. But it makes a difference to you whether you should serve like Judas or John." So I think it's a beautiful way of saying, yes, you will carry out God's purposes, but be very careful how you do that. This is a kind of this paradoxical understanding of God's sovereignty and our responsibility. But the most important thing to understand from God's Word is that we are meant firstly, to be observers. Observers of who or what? Observers of God. That you and I exist in a theater of God. That's why you should have come here this morning, to observe God, what He's like, who He is, what He's about, what's His nature, what's His character, what are His thoughts, so that we could think them after Him. Because we will, John Piper has said, become what we behold. So we are to become a reflection of God, but we cannot become a reflection of God until we behold God. And the Bible is introduced in such a way that it is a story about Him. It's what it's about. So when we flip through the pages, we should not first think, what is our purpose in life? We should first think about God. And as we think about God, we'll find ourselves fulfilling our purpose in looking like Him and imaging Him forth. So it's this thought that helps us begin or continue through the plague narratives in Exodus. We find ourselves in our third plague, or our third sign and wonder, as it's frequently called in the text. And we find that we're at the plague or sign and wonder of gnats. Now, it may not have been gnats. It could have been mosquitoes. It could have been fleas. It could have been lice. The word for this just essentially means like a winged insect. That's all it means. But what we know about this as we read on is that as God brought them out of the dust, they went on both man and beast. So whatever sort of insect this was, it's not flies, that's coming next. It's not locusts, they're coming later. But it's something different that comes upon people in an in-your-face sort of way. We got to ask ourselves, what does plague number 3 tell us about God? If we are created and given a book to learn about who He is, what does plague number 3 tell us about who God is? Just recently, I was privileged to be able to have lunch with Brian Jones. Grew up in this church. Many of you are familiar with Brian, dear friends with him. And as we were sitting there eating together, I was in the plague of the frogs at that point, and Brian works in a secular workplace, and he's frequently seeking to share the gospel with people. He shared with me one friend that he's sharing the gospel with presently, and he said, "So tell me how you take something like the plague of the frogs and make it applicable to the world out there." And that's such an appropriate question. It's the role and job of a pastor to do that in order to equip you to be able to do that. So when we look at the gnats or the mosquitoes, fleas, lice, whatever they were, how do we do that to the world out there, or even to our hearts and minds in here? How do we make this applicable to us right now and to the world right now? Well, I think it's easy for the world to take pot shots at the Scriptures, especially the Old Testament, and talk about how esoteric it is, how distant, how unrelatable, not applicable to our current lives, and that sort of thing. And when someone does that, I think it's important to state to them that they are not taking God on His terms. And they have that freedom to do that. But if they really want to get to the guts of what God was doing in the plagues and understand Him as He would like to be understood, as it's important for us to understand Him better, then we should take Him on His own terms instead of just quickly taking jabs at something that we haven't taken the time to read ourselves. So let's say the world says, well, I'll take the time, I'll read it, and I'll still think it's as stupid as I do now. Well, let's read it and let's try to understand it. So as we do, so we enter into the plague narratives and say, what do they have to do with me? What do they have to do with today? What do they have to do with our world? It's important to understand that the plagues are in response to 2 primary questions that Exodus opens with. I've shared this with you last week. Those 2 questions are Moses' question to God when God commissions him, which is, if they ask your name, when I go to Israel, if they ask your name, what should I tell them? So God is setting out to answer that question. What's my name? What am I like? Name is a precious thing. It's a personal thing. What's my name? What am I like? How am I to be understood? And then the second question is, this one posed by Pharaoh when Moses and Aaron go to approach him to grant release for Israel. And Pharaoh says, "Who is the Lord?" So these are two questions. What's your name? Who are you? Everything that follows in Exodus 1 through 15, chapters 1 through 15, are in response to those two questions. What's my name and what am I like? Who am I? So, it's important literarily, if you're going to ask what significance does plague 3 have for my life, to say why plague 3 is even there. And the answer to that is that God's name and character has been lost upon humanity. The fall decimated our understanding of God. So the plagues are meant to resurrect who He is and what He's like. That's the significance of the plagues. Now, as the plagues begin to unfold and march in certain order, we have to ask, okay, what do they tell us about who God is, what He's like? This morning, I'm going to give 5 answers to that question, or those questions. What's your name? Who are you? The first answer to that question that we learn from plague number 3 is this. We learn of the vastness of God's dominion. The vastness of God's dominion. What do I mean by that? Well, we've learned from plagues 1 and 2, the Nile turning to blood and then frogs coming out of the Nile upon Egypt. We've learned that God has mastery over water. The ancient mindset had an understanding of the universe in 3 realms. You had water, you had land, and you had the heavens or the sky. And you occasionally see a fourth where there's water beneath the land. So the question is of these realms, what are the gods of those realms? Well, up to this point, God has demonstrated Himself to be God of the water, specifically the Nile that He turned to blood, and then He had frogs come out of the Nile, sort of transitioning to land. But so far, He's only demonstrated Himself to be a God of the water. Now, in this third plague, He demonstrates Himself to be the God of the land, where the gnats come out of the dust upon the ground. So what this demonstrates is the vastness of His dominion, the vastness of His domain. He is God of water. He is now also definitively God of land, of which Egypt had a god for. So He's dethroning polytheism, Egyptian gods in nearly all the plagues, and He does so here as well. So that's the first truth. This is demonstrating that God is God of water, God of land as well. The second truth about who God is and what He's like is that He is God over apparent chaos. He is God over apparent chaos. See, friends, you got to understand that if you and I were in this situation, it would be very easy, at least for me, to be able to think that just chaos has broken out upon the earth. I mean, even people are thinking that today and what's going on just in our country with the fires and the like, that the earth is out of control. It's just out of control. That we got heat fluctuations and then we got cold and just everything's out of control. But there's no deity ascribed to it. It's just what it is. It's just crazy out there. Either in the natural realm or in the moral realm of our country at this point. It's just easy thing. It's just nuts. It's crazy. And it would have been very easy to think that of the plagues as they began to break out upon Egypt. But God makes it definitively clear that this is not chaos. This is organized chaos. How does He make that clear? Well, I've mentioned to you some time ago that as you read through the plague narratives, you find that they very naturally break into 3 divisions and 4 with the 10th plague. That as you read through them, you find similarities to such an extent that the first 3 plagues work in harmony with the second set of 3 plagues, with the third set of 3 plagues, which then isolates the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, keeping it totally unique, which it clearly is in the text. It receives way more attention than the previous 9 plagues. These 9 plagues, broken up into 3 triads, have some harmony, some similarities among them. As you break them into 3 sets of 3, you find that the first of each set of 3 is delivered to Pharaoh early in the morning, generally at the Nile. It happens with 2, the third is assumed. The second of each of the plagues, of each of the 3 sets, is delivered to Pharaoh at his own palace, in his domain. And then the third of each triad is delivered without warning. It just befalls, and this is the third, delivered without warning. He takes his staff, he hits the dust, instantly gnats come. There's no discussion with Pharaoh. It just instantly happens. And it happens that way with the third, and then the third of the next set of 3, and then the third of the next set of 3. 6 and 9. Beyond that, Aaron is the prime mover in all of the 3 of the first set. God is the prime mover of all of the 3 in the second set. And Moses is the prime mover of all of the 3 in the third set. Now, what is this about? What is the point? The point is this. I want you to listen to commentator Nahum Sarna. He writes, "The controlling purpose behind this literary architecture is to emphasize the idea that the 9 plagues are not random vicissitudes of nature. Although they are natural disasters, they are the deliberate and purposeful acts of divine will, their intent being retributive, coercive, and educative." In other words, as easy as it would be to think that creation has just gone awry, the order, this systemic order to what's happening in these plagues demonstrates otherwise. That as chaotic as it appears, it is organized chaos to such an extent that God will stop and start the plagues at His own choosing. So this is organized chaos, purposeful chaos. We see this even in the flood. The flood may appear to be total chaos unleashed upon the earth. But as the flood would be recounted to Noah's descendants, you find that the animals came upon the ark 2 by 2 in organized fashion. And you say, as nuts as the flood was, you still find organization in it. So, first, we find that this plague demonstrates the vastness of God's dominion. Second, that God is God over apparent chaos. And then third, we learn that He is a God that is above all gods. He alone is God. There's no one like Him. This plague demonstrates that when the magicians of Pharaoh, of secret arts, the priests, so to speak, of Pharaoh, are unable to replicate this plague for the first time. Even to the point where they will confess, this is the finger of God. Now, it's generally spoken. They say Elohim. They don't say Yahweh. They don't have a personal relationship with God. They're just saying, look, this is a higher power involved that we are no longer able to compete with. We got to understand that this would be the equivalent of, in our day, who our God, I would submit, is science, misaligned science. It would be equivalent to the scientists of our day, such as Richard Dawkins or a Sam Harris or a Christopher Hitchens, renowned, outspoken atheists, saying finally, okay, as much as we hate to admit it, this appears to be the work of a higher power. We're turning in our card of authority here at this point. Something bigger than us and what we thought possible is happening right now. So, third, it demonstrates that no one is like God. Excuse me. But beyond demonstrating the vastness of His domain, the power over apparent chaos, the certainty and uniqueness of His existence, these plagues move beyond who God is, and they begin to tell us what He's like. What He's like. Not just that He's there, but what He's about. What His personality is like. What His character is like. Not just He's in the White House, so to speak, but the inner sanctum of who He is. These are points 4 and 5. And I want to say right at the outset what God's like, what He demonstrates Himself to be in this plague and the others, is that He is both fierce in getting our attention with His presence, and He's also tender. And anybody I trust that knows Christ in this room or who's listening to this message, that would be able to resonate with them. That if you know God through His Son, Jesus Christ, there have been times in your lives where you've sensed the fierceness of God in getting your attention and also the tenderness in God in getting your attention. Let's talk first about the fierceness. Fierce. How is God fierce in this plague? Well, as I mentioned before in chapter 8, verse 17, it says, Aaron stretched out his hand with his staff and struck the dust of the earth, and there were gnats on man and beast, that all the dust atop the earth within Egypt turned into gnats, or mosquitoes, or fleas, or lice. Where's the fierceness in that? Well, I can tell you from personal experience that as we take wilderness trips every other year with some of the men in the church, without a doubt, hands down, worst wilderness trip we've ever been on, in my opinion, was in the Wind River Range in Wyoming. It's some of the most beautiful territory I personally have ever seen, but it was the worst trip. And the reason for that is because as we were hiking up the trail, we passed a couple hikers that were hiking down, and they said, the mosquitoes are horrendous. And you got to know that we specifically, or I specifically, choose the dates of these trips to be in the fall so that I don't have to hear or see or feel a mosquito. We plan these trips in August and September so that the mosquitoes are done, gone, away. So when these hikers told me that, I thought they were kidding. But we got to our first campsite, and it was just what they described. It got to the place, while we were hiking, it wasn't so bad, but when we got to our campsites for the night, it involved setting up a tent, getting in the tent, killing the mosquitoes that got in the tent while you were setting it up, and then zipping it shut, killing the mosquitoes, and then laying in your tent till it was time to cook dinner. You'd cook dinner, you'd get back in your tent, and you'd go to sleep every night. It was miserable. And that paled in comparison to what they're experiencing in Egypt. Horrendous. You got to envision that as the magicians were seeking to replicate this, they were very likely batting like crazy as they were trying to do it. As they spoke the words to Pharaoh, we can't replicate this, they were probably spitting out the bugs that had gotten in their mouth when they talked. cleaning out their eyes and their ears, going crazy. That is the fierceness with which God will go to get our attention. But it's also tender. Yes, that doesn't sound tender to me. That sounds horrific. How is it tender? Well, it's tender in the sense, going back to our wilderness illustration, in that as bad as Wind River was, when we got home, when we got back in the vans and our cell phones got service, we didn't receive news that one of our children had died. Fleas, lice, mosquitoes, they're tender when it compares to losing a child. And what we begin to see here is that there is an escalation taking place within these plagues. It starts separate from them in the Nile. It begins getting into their business with the frogs. But the winged insects takes it to a whole nother level. You can potentially keep frogs out of a closed room once you clear them out after entering in. But you can't do that so easily with these winged insects. They're all over the place. And amazingly, this plague is not said to have come to an end. In many of the plagues, there's a termination listed. In this one, there's not. Now you could think, well, Moses just forgot to put that part. Well, he doesn't forget in the 8th plague. He remembers to tell you that the locusts were driven away in the 8th plague, but he doesn't tell you that here, which leads us to believe that this one may have went on for a while, piled atop what's to come. But it's still tender. For all its fierceness, it's tender, because it doesn't even come close to comparing losing a child. So we find that there is mercy amidst God's wrath. And so, those are the 5 things that we learn about God from this 3rd plague. But let us take a second to be reminded why these plagues are coming. I've talked to you about that at the beginning. Let me continue that thought here for a moment. Why is God doing this? Well, Pharaoh, we know, is associated, just from history and archaeology, with the serpent, specifically the cobra. We see that reflected in the text when Aaron and Moses come to Pharaoh and they throw their staff on the ground. It turns into a serpent. His magicians do the same thing, but Aaron's staff swallows up their serpents. For Pharaoh to think that that wasn't reflective of his nature, being associated with a snake, a cobra, would be crazy. He very likely would have understood a similarity there, but the imagery gets richer as you go back to Genesis 3, and that Satan himself took on the embodiment of a snake, of a serpent. So you find a parallelism going on with Pharaoh very likely being presented in such a way that he is the offspring of the serpent which God predicted in Genesis 3. That the offspring of the serpent, the seed of the serpent, would be at enmity with the seed of the woman. And we see that taking place with Pharaoh. He is an antichrist, anti-God of sorts. But the similarities between Pharaoh's alignment with the seed of the serpent even gets deeper when we get into Exodus 1:10, when it says that as Pharaoh saw that the people of Israel were multiplying and growing, he said to his people, let's deal shrewdly, craftily with them. And of course, this reminds us of Genesis 3 as the serpent's introduced, and it says now there was no other animal craftier than the serpent. But the imagery even gets richer. Consider what commentator Orrin Martin points out when he says, as Exodus begins, just consider how similar it is what Pharaoh did to the people of Israel and what sin did to Adam and Eve. We find that Adam's sin, God cursed the ground and made labor excruciatingly hard, that He would only take from it by the sweat of His brow. And we find Pharaoh doing what to Israel? Making them work incredibly hard. Beyond that, we find that Eve's situation, she's disciplined in the area of child labor, making child labor very painful. And what do we find Pharaoh doing to the women? Something very similar to that. He's wanting to kill their baby boys as they're born, similarly affecting the area of child labor. And then finally, man dies as a result of his sin, and Pharaoh is committing infanticide, seeking to kill all the boys, obliterate them from the people of Israel. So Martin goes on to say this, catch this, all of which are associated with life outside the Garden of Eden. So Pharaoh is essentially a typification of life without God. It's what he's doing to the people of Israel. What he's doing is essentially the same thing the serpent did at the very beginning, which was seeking to replace the name of God, which was central to the world and humanity, and replacing that with humanity being in the center above God. Now Pharaoh is seeking to do the very same thing, placing humanity at the center, namely himself. And God is saying, no, that is not good for humanity. I will crush that. I will obliterate it. And in its place, I will put my name in such a way that it will never be forgotten. And it's not to this day. God was successful. Whenever, I mentioned before that when you see, locusts come, it'll very often be reported in the newspaper as of biblical proportions. That sort of thing. This story, this true story, lives on to this day. So this is why God is having to resurrect His name, because it's been replaced, and it's continually threatened to being replaced by humanity, even in our own day. But this account and our heralding of the Bible's account of reality puts God back in the place. And it's not our power that makes it win. The gospel is the power of God unto salvation. So we shouldn't be ashamed of speaking truth, because it's not in our eloquence that the truth resides on the throne. It's in God's power in the truth that causes it to reside on the throne. So we just speak truth. We speak gospel to the people around us and allow God to do the heavy lifting. Amen? I want to close with a few observations from Plague 3. First, it's important to note that it wasn't until Plague 4 that there was a distinction being made between Israel and Egypt. So I just want you to let that sink in for a moment. Israel itself would have experienced the Nile turning to blood, the frogs overcoming their territory, and these winged insects being all over them while they worked and sweat and still sought their own straw and didn't meet their quotas, so they got beat. It never stopped for Israel until the fourth plague. I point that out to obliterate the thought in many Christian minds that God and His plan for us is a sort of amalgamation of God's will and the American dream. That God's will for my life must always be happy and joyful and wonderful. And my body should always perform just so to bring that result. And my job should perform just so to bring that result. And my family and my marriage and everything about my life should just perform just so that I will be happy. That is God's will for my life. If that's true, then man, did he botch it with Israel in Egypt. Man, did he botch it with Paul being decapitated in Rome. Man, did he botch it with his own son. This life is not about dodging hardship. In fact, as you faithfully read the Scriptures, you'll find there's even a sense in which hardship is embraced. Maybe the most popular passage in all the Scriptures, maybe in competition with John 3:16, would be Psalm 23. And in Psalm 23, David says, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." It's taken as it's granted. I'm going to experience the valley of the shadow of death. But He's with me there. Paul takes it to a level where he says, we embrace it. Romans 5:3-5, he says, we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not put us to shame. Because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. So sufferings are not something to be dodged, but to be rejoiced in. And we have to get the thought out of our brains that the American dream is God's dream. Not for this earth. In the next earth, in a sense, but not now. Right now, sufferings perform a vital role in the Christian life. To such an extent that Paul will say, no one will enter the kingdom of heaven without experiencing it. It's bound to come. Favorite musician Rich Mullins has a song, there's bound to come some trouble in this life, but that ain't nothing to be afraid of. He's been there before, and He knows what it's like. And He'll meet you there. So the first thing to take away is that we got to rid ourselves of this notion of an amalgamation of God's will and the American dream. But second, so we got to understand the slow progression of the plagues upon Pharaoh in Egypt. Shared with you before that you've got the Nile being turned to blood, but it's separate from everyone. It's very integral to their life, but it's still separate from them. It's got boundaries. The frogs transcend that boundary and they start getting up into our business. But these winged creatures, they are all about our business to a very unfortunate level. So you see that it's growing in intensity. It's enough to image that God is essentially kicking down the door of Pharaoh's palace, and He's walking in, and the guards get in His way, and He takes care of them, and He's working His way into the inner sanctum of Pharaoh's place, up until the point where He gets him at the jugular and up against the wall. And you might think, man, I don't like picturing God that way. Then you're just wrong. Because that's what He's like. It's what He's doing. The words that are used that we translate plagues are just blows, strike, hit. This is what's happening. He is throttling Pharaoh. It's a forceful encounter. But it starts with less intensity and moves to greater. And I don't think it's too much to say that it's very much how sin works in our lives. Just consider the words of Jesus from John 10:10. He describes the thief, and he says, the thief comes to what? Steal, kill, and destroy. Let me ask you, is having something stolen from you bad? It's bad. Nobody likes it. Someone's stealing from our car. I got a friend, someone was stealing from his car in his neighborhood, so he set up a camera and caught him. Got it on tape. Getting in your car and thinking, I thought I had, it releases you the first few times. You think, I probably I misplaced it. But as soon as the feeling hits you, someone's been in my car? Someone stole this? It's very unsettling. What about being murdered compared to having something stolen? Is that worse? That's surely worse. You say, what could be worse than being murdered? What about being destroyed, very likely getting into the eternal realm? It's one thing to be killed. It's another thing to have an eternal destiny that is summarized as destruction by Paul. Hell as destruction. So you see an escalation in what the thief does. He steals. He kills. He wants to destroy you. He wants you to be in eternity with hell, in hell with him. That's what he wants ultimately for everybody. Misery loves company, and it's what Satan wants. And this is the way that sin works. Sin in our lives results in greater and greater and greater harm. First, he may steal joy within a marriage. Then he may steal the marriage. You see, it's escalating. It's what Satan wants. It's what he's about. And so we have to be very thoughtful when we approach sin. Because at first, as I mentioned before, we are considering ourselves outside of the sin. We dabble, but we're actually still outside it. We can still think with our right minds. We cannot even like the fact that we did what we did. But pretty soon that distinction is blurred. It's lost. And now the sin is actually a depiction of who we are. It's where we actually feel most comfortable. When people that we love come to us and say, hey, this is bad. You're getting into a danger zone here. You're like, I don't think I like you anymore. Pretty soon, they're avoided. It's happening. It's happening. It's just unbelievable, the truth of this in reality. I see it. I see people get blocked on Facebook. I get blocked on Facebook. And I think to myself, I'm a sort of a passive guy. I think. And as the person blocks the people that love them in their lives, whether it's actually intentionally on a forum like Facebook or someplace else not answering their calls, whatever it is, shouldn't the person begin thinking, like a year ago I would have said this guy loves me to death, or this person loves me to death, and now I'm totally disassociated. Am I nervous about that? Am I nervous the territory I find myself in? Or do I still think it's all A-okay? Be a point for an interview to happen. Like, what are you thinking now? Like 2 years ago, you just said this guy or this girl is after your best interest, but then, amazingly, they're not anymore. This is what happens. And it grows, and it grows, and it grows. Until the point where you are an island that no one wants to live on, including yourself. And that's where Satan brings you to the next place. Friends, this is the operation of evil and its effect on our lives. But let's contrast that with Jesus' next words in John 10:10. The thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. But I've come that you may have life. And then he adds, and have it abundantly. And I want to just stop a second on that. Let's talk about life abundant in plague number 3. What does God turn into gnats, fleas, mosquitoes, lice? Dust. Let's talk about dust for a moment. It's funny, in the first 2 books of the Bible, dust is talked about quite a bit, believe it or not. Let's talk about the way that God uses dust in the book of Genesis. What's the first way God uses dust? I'm looking at you guys are a bunch of dust bags. Jaron in the first service whispered dust bunnies. It's making it a little better, right? We're dust. But look what amazing things God can do with dust. Shakespeare, Mozart, Beethoven, they're dust. All the musicians that performed, all the actors that played out Shakespeare's plays, all these things, the artists. Consider Rembrandt, Da Vinci. Consider what God can do with dust. The laughter, the joy, the love, the friendship. Amazing parenting, kids, grandparenting, skilled labor. Amazing what God can do with dust. Wonderful things. And then second, we find dust very positively in the Scriptures. You remember when God told Abraham to go out into the night sky and look into the stars and count them if he can, and that the stars would be outnumbered by his descendants? What a beautiful image that was. But that's actually the second image God gave Abraham. That was a night image. You know, Abraham's a camper. He's a tent guy. So the night sky would have been brilliant in his day. No light pollution. Stars are a big deal. But what was a big deal during the day? Dust, sand, that sort of thing. And so Abraham would walk the earth. He's planting altars of worship all through Canaan, and he would have seen dust. He would have walked with his head down. He would have seen it in the distance. He would have felt it. He would have tasted it. He would have cleaned it off his feet at night. And God says, I want you to look at the dust, and when you do, I want you to think about your descendants, how plentiful they'll be as I bless you. So here's what I want you to see. I want you to see the contrast of God's hand in dust. It can be brilliantly wonderful, or it can be horrendously awful. And I want you to listen to this verse from Psalm 18, 25 to 27. With the merciful, you show yourself merciful. With the blameless man, you show yourself blameless. With the purified, you show yourself pure. And with the crooked, you make yourself seem torturous. For you save a humble people, but the haughty eyes you bring down. So you got the same God. You got the same God. And you've got Him experienced on the one hand in an amazingly wonderful way. And then you have Him experienced on the other hand in a horrendously awful way. What's the difference? The difference is a person of mercy, a person that's blameless, and a person that's purified, a person that's humble. And then all of us hang our heads because none of us are that person. But Jesus stands up. And Jesus says, I am that person. And I'm going to lay my life down so that everybody else can be that person. And we can stand before you pure, blameless, humble, merciful, and we will receive the beauty that you have to offer your people. And I stand gladly with Christ. And I encourage you to stand gladly with Christ too, and allow His identity to be your identity. For you to stop envisioning yourself and your identity by your past behavior or even current, but to put on the identity of Christ. Paul writes to the most unhealthy church in all the Bible, the church of Corinth. And instead of browbeating them, he says, remove the leaven from you, indicative of sin, and be unleavened. For you are unleavened. In other words, embrace the identity that Christ has already given. Don't become the identity. You can't. It can only be given. But Christ has made you clean, so be clean and get the uncleanness out of your life. Friends, we'll move into Plague 4 next week, Lord willing, and we'll find that the distinction is starting to be made amongst Israel and Egypt. And friends, I want to live distinctly identified by Christ, not by Ben Lovelady. Are you with me? Are you with me? Amen. I'll ask the musicians to come.